The Dark Forest, a beautiful, mystical, magical place that is full of people, places, things, and most importantly, potential profits. Yes, there is indeed a vast fortune to be made out in these parts, if you know what you're doing, that is. And I, a handsome, swashbuckling gentleman by the name of Rin, just so happen to be one of those magnificent people who know what they're doing. On a dangerous planet full of orcs and dark elves, as well as many other different creatures with sharp teeth and even sharp swords, I plan to make my mark and my legacy by creating a nice safe place for people to come and live and work and eat and sleep and everything. In a region on the main trade road, I am going to be setting up a nice little tavern slash inn slash a little bit of everything. Around these parts, the bare minimum is even hard to come by, like a nice safe place to sleep at night, so I think people will be tickled plum pink to see what we have to offer. But as it stands currently, we have absolutely nothing to offer except for maybe a little bit of friendship, and thus we are going to begin by collecting some resources by deconstructing some old structures in the area for steel and stone blocks, as well as plenty of wood from cutting down trees in the area. By the time that the moon was rising in the sky, and it was getting to be around bedtime or so, we used some of this wood to build ourselves a nice, warm, and toasty fire. Not only would this keep us cozy at night as we slept, but the fire would also keep predators away, which are notorious in a forest such as this. But as I awoke, I found myself to be mighty peckish. Damn near starving even, but that's when I remembered that I had plenty of rations tucked away in my pockets. Just a bit of dried berries, jerky, and some hardtack bread. Nothing too fancy. If only the folks of my old town could see me now, out in the forest, eating some dried up meat and berries. They would surely regret evicting me from my cottage. But after a nice quick wash in the old creek, it was time for us to get back to work. Much of what we plan on building here in this area is going to require a lot of wood, and thus why we're putting such a heavy focus on so much deforestation in this little area here. But not only that, the vegetation of the Dark Forest is extremely dense, and thus we need to get rid of it regardless, that way we have enough room to build things. Speaking of which, using the logs that we have, we threw up some log pillars to hold up a roof, built a small shabby little roof, and then threw down a nice log bed as well as a table with some stools, that way we can eat our meals. It's not exactly my old luxury cottage, but you know what, I don't mind roughing it a bit. Besides, the sights out in these parts are beautiful, and the more structure that we have to our home, the less likely we are to get eaten by some type of creature. Speaking of which, I thought it might be a good time for us to go about outlining our borders. Not only does this help us determine what part of this land is our property already, but it'll also help us keep out any unwanted monsters, animals, and even worst of all, humanoids. As we were building, though, a wild raccoon went insane and decided to start trying to scratch at us and bite at us, and thus we rushed over to the river to pick up a log, but before we could get it to smash its head, we started kicking it and it died. Thankfully, these fertile lands also contain plenty of herbal medicine that we can use to make sure we don't get rabies. With the threat now neutralized, we could finally finish up this portion of our fencing. But the danger of this wild animal did make me think that we need to begin protecting ourselves, and the best way to do that is to make sure that we have the right equipment in case we have another wild animal, or worse, an orc invasion or something to that effect, and thus why we ended up making ourselves a steel knife as well as a wooden bow. Now, not only can we deal with pesky critters from a distance, but we can also preemptively begin hunting them to avoid any issues and also to fill our bellies with meat. Now, with that finally taken care of, I felt that this was an ample time for us to begin putting in the groundwork for our tavern slash inn slash whatever we're going to end up calling it, and we immediately began building some foundational walls and pieces of it to set up a few bedrooms as well as a main area where people can enjoy meals and drink and whatever else they want to do. However, the internal portion of our inn would remain unfinished until we began acquiring some proper timber boards, which we were sawing at a crafting spot with some sharp stones, which wasn't exactly efficient, so we were able to expedite this process with a proper workbench with some proper stone saws. Now finally, with a good stockpile of our wooden boards, we could begin laying those boards out in staggered lines, making a nice, beautiful wooden flooring. A little bit rustic and rough around the edges, but a good start, I'll say. And with that, the bones and structure of our inn were finally completed. On the first floor, you'll notice that we have a largely empty area, which is actually where we plan on building our tavern section, where people can drink and enjoy some meals. And if you'll be so kind as to follow me upstairs, you'll see that we actually have our rooms that we plan on renting out. Currently, we only have 3, and one of which is mine. However, of course, before we go about renting out our rooms, we still have quite a bit of business to attend to, such as building a proper outhouse out behind the inn near the river. That way, we and our guests have a proper place to relieve ourselves. We would also hook it up to some wooden plumbing. That way, we're not having to scoop out the waste every few days. And of course, it's very important to note that we ended up putting this downriver from where the actual inn is going to be, as if it were above it, well, we would have poo floating down the river where we bathe and get drinking water. It would be a very shitty situation. To help us out a little bit, we would also take some sandstone blocks, dig a hole in the ground, and make ourselves a nice little well. This way, we have some water flow to our latrine. That way it washes downstream from where it's at, and also that way we don't have to travel as far to get some bathing water. And with that, our business has come along quite nicely. I believe that it may finally be time for us to let some guests in, but before we do so, one more thing. This shouldn't just be some shabby little inn where they have to go for the night when it starts getting dark or when the elements make them need shelter. This should be somewhere that they enjoy staying, and thus I want to improve these rooms with some proper tables, some end tables to sleep next to, as well as some chests to store all their goods. And now finally, we can begin renting out our 2 vacant rooms. We're only going to be doing about 10 silver per night, and the reason being, of course, as this is the lowest that we can charge. It seems like a pretty fair price to me. But as we were preparing for our grand opening, out in the woods was a gentleman with a hatchet, and it would seem that he's come here to scalp us and skin us with it. Needless to say, we weren't exactly excited about this proposition, and thus we began firing our bow and arrow at him. I had assumed that this ruffian would run and tuck tail after a few broadheads pierced his breast, but apparently he was foolish enough to stay until one hit his heart. Ah, such a shame. On the bright side, however, we could use his hatchet for our tree chopping escapades, such as when we decided to begin building some proper dirt pathing around our inn. That way we can ensure proper mobility and maneuverability all around it in case any enemies were to get through our wooden fencing, and just for day-to-day operations, of course. At one point, though, in the dark of night, behind some foliage, I noticed that we had a wild woman, an elf, who had wandered in. Since I have a pretty high animal skill, and be she more animal than human, I decided it might be a good idea for us to attempt to tame her. In the beginning, my efforts were completely in vain, as I would fail every single time, but not to worry, I'm sure she'll come around. As they say, the way to a woman's heart is through her stomach, and since this seems to be a pretty motivating factor for our wild woman friend, I thought it might be best if she saw us plant a very large row of rice that we're going to need throughout the winter anyhow, and apparently this seemed to work. Not only would she join us, but by golly, it would seem that she even knows how to speak Elvish as well as human. A woman of many talents, no doubt, the perfect employee for our inn. Such a good employee, in fact, that she was actually the one that suggested that we should give ourselves a name here, so we decided to go with the Rotten Boar Fellowship, and we would actually end up calling our little business here the Rotten Boar Inn. Reason being, we don't exactly expect to get that much high-class clientele, you could say, and we're more looking for the salt-of-the-earth type of people. Or perhaps even bandits, raiders, and other types of criminals, just depending on who has silver in their pockets. For the moment, we'll have her working at the desk, that way she could check in our clientele whenever they decide to rent rooms, and they'll be able to purchase some of our goods and services. The only problem is, at the moment, we don't exactly have anything to sell. So, we decided to fix that little issue by building a nice and beautiful and very warm stone hearth right in the middle of the inn so people can get nice and warm and cozy from their long journeys on the road, but also more importantly, we'll be able to go about beginning to cook some nice soups. Not only are these the same meals that we and our employees will be eating, but of course these are also the soups that we'll be selling to our guests for a little bit of moolah. Speaking of which, we have our very first guest from House Oswin. You may have noticed we've had quite a few offers of people coming through the area, but we've turned them away every time. But now we are finally going to accept our first guest, as I feel we are truly ready. I understand this might seem a little bit silly, because if we were accepting guests this entire time, we would have been making more money than what we're going to make off renting these rooms out for 10 silver apiece right now, and that is correct, but if they don't have a good time and enjoy their stay, there's a very low chance of them coming back and spending more money, so we had to make sure our quality was up to par. While rice and berry soup is pretty great for our guests, something that would be better is some meat, and of course wild game is plentiful in the area. The only problem is we don't currently have a slaughterhouse, so we began working on one. But before we could finish that, our guests were ready to depart, and as you can see, they were tickled pink with their stay here, and this is exactly what I was hoping for and what I was talking about. Now they'll go out and spread the good word about the Rotten Boar Inn, and we should get plenty more customers. They enjoyed their stay so much, in fact, that they ended up leaving us a war bow as well as a recurve bow, and these are going to be perfect for hunting down wild game and defending ourselves. Speaking of which, we had finally finished up our little slaughterhouse here, and we would be able to store plenty of meat for the winter to come, as well as fats, bones, and pelts, and even a few animal heads, which we would end up using for our mounted taxidermies. If you're a long-term fan of the channel, you'll know that this mod is basically in every damn series that I do, but I do find it particularly useful in this series and very fitting. Now that we have our first employee, things were feeling a little bit cramped back at the inn, especially since we were already taking up one of our rooms that we planned on renting out, and thus because of that and the fact that we are going to be the lord of this here region, we decided to build ourselves a nice cozy little cabin in the backwoods. Realistically, it's only a few yards to the north of our inn, but it is quite hidden by trees, and I should put a real emphasis on cozy and little, as it is a very small cottage. But even so, it is quite luxurious given the circumstances, and there's plenty of room for expansion in the very near future. Now, we've been collecting and expending a lot of our resources on ourselves, and of course the quality of our inn for our guests, but something that we've yet to do since the beginning of the video is work on our defenses. So that's exactly what we planned on doing by building some more spiked wooden fencing to try and protect ourselves from raiders and barbarians. We do have a large river running right in the middle of our area here in our property, so we're going to need to deal with that as well. We also threw together something of a granary silo, that way we could try to keep all of our rice in there to keep it from getting damp and also expiring so quickly. However, in the middle of construction, we were now under attack once more. It was a group of about 4 or so of these ruffians, and thankfully, as they were beginning to approach our inn, we began firing at them with our newly fastened bows, and we were managing to hit them fairly often, and thanks to our animal bone spike traps, we ended up taking the majority of them down as the others began to flee. One of them, by the name of Tadashi, was still alive somehow from his injuries, and thus we decided to begin tending to his wounds, and we even thought that it might be a good idea for us to go about capturing him. Given the type of clientele that we plan on hosting here, a face and attitude like his might be exactly what we need in terms of a new employee. But this will take some time, so we'll check back in on him in a moment. Thankfully, by this point, we had also finally finished up our granary, and it was time for us to start stocking it up with all the rice that we had grown thus far. We would also chuck in some other things like wild berries and bear berries and things of that sort. Of course, this will prevent those items from deteriorating away, but will also allow them to be frozen by the winter winds and thus prolonging their deterioration as well. Because one thing is for sure, we do care about money and our guests and our clientele and yada yada yada, but when winter comes, there's a very high chance of us starving to death if we don't grow and collect collect enough food for it. A bit of time later though, and we had a young lad by the name of Dial who was stating that he was being chased by 4 disgusting orcs. The barbaric bastards were chasing this child down to try and murder him, and he was requesting sanctuary here, to which of course we accepted. Under one condition, he would become an employee, but I don't think the young lad would mind that. The orcs were hot on his heels, chasing him throughout the forest towards our inn, and as they would approach, we would begin loosing many an arrow in their general direction. We knew orcs weren't all that intelligent, so we would quickly lead them across the bridge into our bone spike traps. The spike traps would manage to take out one of their members, and we would end up taking out yet another with our bows. We would cross the river once more back towards our home, leading them across, slowing them down where we could fire at them once more, killing yet another orc, leaving one more left. With this injured fella here being the last one to survive, we decided to try to rush him with our spears, sticking him in his sides, and thus finishing him off. Ah yes, well that takes care of that. You need to be more careful out there, kiddo. The best way to handle a posse full of orcs is to use your noggin. Outsmart their brawn with your brains, as they say. But not to worry, as long as you're living here under our roof, you will always be protected. Just mop the floors or something for us, will ya? But as fall comes to an end and winter is soon beginning with even more mouths to feed, we need to do something about our food situation. We have enough rice right now to maybe last us, but if we continue getting more people, especially guests, we won't have enough food to last through winter. So we decided to begin overhauling our hunting process. Luckily for us, this area is very fertile with berries as well as wild game, as you well know, and thus we would also begin collecting plenty of berries and other wild fruits to add to our storage. As we continue getting more guests this winter as well as other people joining us as employees of the inn, we also face the issue of not enough housing and overcrowding, and thus because of this little issue that we could face, we decided to go ahead and build ourselves some proper employee dwellings. Nothing too fancy, just some small rooms that'll keep them warm this winter and out of the snows outside. When things start getting a little chilly in their rooms, all they have to do is crack open the doors, and the fireplace out in the main hallway will keep them nice and toasty. I was quite glad that we had built this when we did as well, because we had also finally recruited the barbarian known as Tadashi into our ranks. As for right now, we'll just have him helping out here and there when we need him to with construction and other things, but once we really get some specific roles going, once we have enough employees, I think Tadashi here is going to be the head of our security. He looks like a rough and tough bouncer who could take care of a few drunken medieval peasants. Now finally, with our rescued child, barbarian, and wild woman out of all of our guest rooms, we can finally set these all 3 up for rent, and they can go off to their little dwellings that we built them. Now that we can ensure that their residential needs are up to par, it was time for us to take on a fairly large task. We're going to begin some deforestation efforts here a little bit west of our inn, just across the river. The foliage and vegetation around these parts are extremely thick, and thus it would take us a good bit of time to get a little spot cleared out. But once we finally did, we actually started construction with the wood that we had chopped down in this area on some small little cottages and or log cabins that we plan on renting out. Now we're not actually going to be renting these out per night like we are with the rooms in the inn. We actually plan on renting these out to tenants who will pay us a monthly fee to stay here in the safety of our walls and our fencing. With temperatures beginning to drop below freezing, people need somewhere that they can stay for seasons on end, not just for a few nights. This world is a very harsh place to live in, harsh enough already, so some of the poorer and maybe rougher around the edges type of people need a place like this to stay, and we're happy to take them in for a low fee. So by us building these little cabins and posting up on a little notice board for the courier service to come and take out to anyone who has the coinage, you could think of it like a service almost, except, you know, obviously it's not very charitable, but whatever. Now of course, since folks are going to be entrusting their safety and the safety of their loved ones if there's multiple people coming, such as a family, into our cherishing, loving hands, we need to ensure that we are able to protect them all, and thus we are going to be completing our wooden spike fencing wall all around this area. The process of which ended up taking us quite a few days, but while we were constructing constructing this, we ended up getting our very first tenant. A 23-year-old lady by the name of Sissy was looking for a place to stay this winter, and more importantly, was willing to pay a total of 300 silver. Now, of course, if she likes her accommodations here, though, she would be willing to renew this tenancy and continue paying us indefinitely, even maybe into spring and summer, but that's a long shot, so we'll see how it goes. Sometime later, we had finally finished up our wooden spike fencing all around the area as promised, and by golly, I am feeling safer already. But I can always feel quite a bit safer, and by using plenty of wooden planks as well as animal bones to build more spike traps on the eastern and western entrances to our little road here, I would end up feeling much safer. Now with the fences taken care of, I wanted to begin upgrading our rooms that we're renting out. So far, we've only been charging 10 silver per night, and the reason being, of course, is because we have some shabby log furniture in there with some shabby log beds. We've decided to upgrade this to some wooden plank beds with some nice furry pelts on top of them, as well as some new and improved furniture, including some large wooden dressers for our guests to store their articles of clothing while they're here. And now, with all these upgrades, we would actually begin charging 30 silver per night for these rooms instead of 10. Now, I know I made a lot of upgrades for this to still be pretty cheap, but like I said earlier, we don't exactly want the big high-class guest, you know, we want the salt of the earth, yada yada, you heard me earlier. Now, with that completed, it was time for us to start working on some proper pathing as well as bridges across the river, as it can be quite treacherous trying to go across it into our new little area that we're working on, and since the river is so large, we would end up building about 3 or so bridges, including the one we already had. Now, I do realize that this might seem like a pretty minute detail, but this is not only for us, but also for the courier service who comes in and gets our advertisements to take out to the townsfolk around the planet so that they know that we're renting out some cabins. They also bring in the payments of silver that are due for our tenants, and thus, if they were to get washed away by the current of the river, we wouldn't get paid. A bit of time later, and we were getting so sick of storing all of our resources and other items solely inside of our inn, and thus we actually began building something of a warehouse, I suppose you could call it, or a resource depot. Much of our logs and planks and ingots and things like that are in stacks around the inn, but this would be a great place to store some of the excess items like that, as well as bows and different types of apparel and yada yada. Plus, it also really helps declutter the upstairs of our inn where people go to stay in their rooms, and thus they won't have a debuff from seeing all of our resources laying out like this, and thus just increasing their happiness and their stay with us. Speaking of happiness, we were long overdue for some recreational items, so right next to the hearth in the downstairs section of the inn, we would actually end up putting a table with a cup and dice game to try and entertain our guest, and on the outside near our grain silo, we would also build a nice horseshoe pin. The days of us staring at the sky for recreation and taking some walks are, well, probably not over, but we can do these things now too. Last but not least, in terms of our structures for this winter, we're also going to be making ourselves a nice little tanning facility, although we're not exactly going to be tanning these pelts and what have you because we don't currently have the research, but we are going to be drying them out, and that way we can use this simple leather for different types of clothing and other things that we may need it for. We're midwinter right now, and we're doing quite fine in terms of not catching hypothermia so far, but that might not always be the case, and thus we need to be able to make ourselves some woven hats and stuff like that. And with that, I feel like our little property, our region, whatever we should call this here, is doing very well, and I'm very proud of what we've created, and I am truly feeling snugly warm in my bed like a medieval lord. Nothing could take me down from this high. Well, maybe not nothing. It looks like we're being raided by barbarians once more, but this time they have a very skilled and well-armored warrior with them, as well as much higher numbers. We had very little time to put together a game plan or plan of attack as they were coming right for us. Nevertheless, we rushed out to our entrance to begin trying to form a defense, even as crude and makeshift as it would be. We were attempting to take cover behind some trees and stone chunks as they were coming for course, hoping to lead them right into our spike traps, and at first this seemed to work for the most part. But their leader was not fooled so easily. He was vicious and absolutely relentless, coming right for us regardless of the lives of his men. But coming at us alone was a fool's mistake. After pelting him with several arrows, he would eventually hit the ground, bruised and battered. All that was left was a couple of his soldiers. One of them would fall to our might just the same as he, and the other was a bit of a coward and decided to run away to live another day and tell his fellow barbarians about what happened here. A couple of these barbarians would maybe prove to be quite useful at the end, so we decided to begin tending to their wounds. But as their leader began to crawl away in a puddle of his own blood, we finished the coward off and then began taking his nice fur coat, as well as some of his other gear for Tadashi. You know, we could have left him alive, but parading his mutilated corpse throughout the forest really sends a message. Besides, his nice fur coat is actually much more befitting of a lord than a filthy barbarian captain, wouldn't you say? As for a couple of his cohorts who didn't die out in the forest and who have yet to die from blood loss, we would end up capturing both of them, as we hope to have them as our employees. One of them, though, by the name of Eurist, would actually end up being an employee by force, as she is unwaveringly loyal, meaning that we would have to enslave her if we ever plan on having her work for us, which, to be honest with you, we don't really mind. But my friends, I think that we have truly began to build something quite magnificent here in the Dark Forest, a nice safe place for any and all to come, visit, and stay out away from the elements and the treacherous roads. Now, don't get me wrong, this is truly just the start, and we still have much more work to do, but I very much look forward to doing so. But before I go, I wanted to mention that for this series, I do want to try to name our people after any names that you guys provide in the comments section. I may even be open to renaming Ren if I do see a name that I really like with a good description as to why we should provide him with that name. So of course, if you have anything like that in terms of suggestions for the series, names, anything like that, always feel free to leave those in the comments section down below. That being said though, my friends, I bid you farewell. Until next time.